Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, dear listeners, welcome back to the podcast and thank you for tuning into this two-part Q&A episode. Typically, when I have a Q&A episode, I go about gathering the cues in a variety of ways. Sometimes I will put up a story on Instagram and I will ask my newsletter readers if they have any questions to submit for the podcast. Other times, I simply collect a number of questions over time that come up in my check-ins with my clients or talking to my followers on social media. And after I've answered them, I think to myself, that could make a good podcast. And I chuck them all on a list. And once I've gathered a few, then I record one of these episodes. In this particular case, I've employed the latter option, whereby the questions that you're going to hear have been collected in various conversations. So thank you to everyone who, without even knowing, contributed to these episodes. Of course, I'm not going to name names and I'm not going to share information that I've not been given permission to share. I hope that at this point, if you've been listening to me for long enough and if you know me a little bit from these podcasts, you'll know that I really care about my integrity. So anything I share here is shared with permission. The history of these two episodes is actually quite fraught with mishappenings in that this is my second time recording them because the first time the audio came out terrible for both of them and I recorded them one after the other. So unfortunately, I could not use those files. Therefore, hopefully this time I'll be able to record them and upload them more smoothly. And now, without further ado, let's get into the first 4 questions, which are all about training. And then next week, I'm going to cover the remaining questions, which are all about nutrition. The first question is, how long should I rest between sets? Can I rest between arms and legs on unilateral exercises? And how do you know when to start the next set? Now I'm going to focus primarily on how long to rest between sets at first, and then I'm going to answer the other question or the add-on to that question about resting between different limbs or unilateral exercises. First, I want to start by citing some research. And in particular, I'm going to refer to a paper, which is still a preprint, by Singer and colleagues, published just in April 2024, titled Give It a Rest, a systematic review with Bayesian meta-analysis on the effect of interset rest interval duration on muscle hypertrophy. Now, first of all, this was a preprint, meaning that it's not gone through peer review yet. This means that in the future, after the peer review process, when it gets officially published in full, it might have undergone certain changes. Moreover, I was not one of the authors. I am not a researcher. Therefore, what I'm going to give you is my interpretation of the results after reading the paper and hearing some of the authors discuss said paper on their own shows, on their own podcasts. So first of all, my understanding from this paper is that the evidence on rest intervals and how they may benefit hypertrophy is unclear. And there simply isn't enough evidence in total to draw a firm conclusion. The authors of this meta-analysis seem to suggest that resting at least 60 seconds appears to benefit hypertrophy, especially in the limbs, so in the arms and legs. However, it's unclear whether resting longer than 90 seconds adds any more of these benefits. They also note that when resting less than 60 seconds, the subjects in the studies they meta-analyzed seemed to perform fewer reps than when resting more than 60 seconds, but they also pointed out that when the volume was equated, then the differences in performance didn't seem to compromise hypertrophy, meaning if you're going to rest less than 60 seconds, the load you can use and the reps you can perform will be impacted by the fatigue. But if you do more reps to make up for that, then the results may be the same as if you were resting longer. In theory. Now, in practical terms, my view is that doing more sets takes more time than doing fewer sets and resting longer between them. So my preference would go towards the latter. Anyway, taking this all together, and knowing that the evidence at the moment is unclear at best, but it shows a slight benefits towards what the authors refer to as longer rest intervals of above 60 seconds, then my current recommendation is to rest at the very least 60 seconds between sets. In addition to that, I encourage my clients to take an auto-regulative approach whereby they wait for as long as they personally need to feel ready for the next set. And what I mean by ready is that they wait until they feel that their target muscle will be the limiting factor of the set. That is the reason they stop that set. Which means that if they're still huffing and puffing, and their cardiovascular system is still compromised, they're going to wait, because otherwise it's going to be the cardiovascular system that's the limiting factor. And that may mean they're not taking the target muscle close enough to failure, and therefore they're leaving gains on the table. Finally, with new clients especially, who don't really have an understanding of how long to rest between sets, they simply don't have enough experience to use an auto-regulative approach yet, I give some exercise-specific recommendations, whereby if you're doing exercises that are mainly isolation moves, for example, bicep curls or triceps extensions or lateral raises, where you're using only one joint and therefore only one muscle, and or you're doing more reps, so 12, 15, 20 plus reps, then you can rest less time, typically 60 to 90 seconds is enough. On the other hand, if you're doing compound lifts like deadlifts, squats, bench presses, and the like, where you're training more joints and therefore more muscles, and or you're doing a heavier lift where you're doing maybe 5 to 12 reps as opposed to 12 plus, then I would recommend resting a little bit longer, in the realm of 90 seconds to about 3 minutes. So these are my suggestions at this moment in time, based on the evidence we have available and my own personal and coaching experience on how long to rest between sets. As for resting between limbs on unilateral exercises, once again, in order to maximize hypertrophy, you want the limiting factor of each set to be your target muscle. So I definitely encourage you to rest at least a little bit between limbs if you find that after a hard set of split squats on one leg, your heart is still beating really fast and your breath is coming up short and shallow still. Give yourself some time to make sure that you're placing more stimulus on the quads of the opposite leg that you're going to do next. So that should cover the question in full. Now, the next question is deloads. What, how, and when? So basically, what do you need to do about deloads? So let's start with a definition. A 2022 research paper by Bell and colleagues defined deloading as follows: a purposeful reduction in training demand with the intention of enhancing preparedness for successive training cycles. So, what can a purposeful reduction in training demand look like? Typically, there is no one size fits all answer. There is no right or wrong answer really, because we don't have a ton of research on deloading anyway at this moment in time. But typically, during a deload, you will train with less intensity of effort, so further away from failure, less volume, or a combination of less intensity and less volume. And that's how you reduce the training demand. Most people will talk about deload weeks, but you could also choose to only deload for a few days out of the week. It depends on the person. In some cases, you may also choose not to deload at all on purpose because your deloads are already built into your week. For example, my clients who train 2 to 3 days per week don't deload because they don't need to. They have 4 to 5 weeks to recover, and that's their deload. Now, the next part of the question is why. So, what are the benefits, if there are any, of deloads? And based on the definition, the benefit should be enhancing preparedness for successive training cycles. Now, how could this happen, and does this actually happen? The answer to the second part of this question is we don't know, because as I've just said, there isn't a lot of research on deloads, and we haven't been able to uncover the answer just yet. As for the first part, so how does it work? How would a deload help you enhance preparedness? There are two theories. The first is that deloading may resensitize your muscles to growth and therefore boost hypertrophy. And it's based on the concept that muscles are sensitive to the training stimulus, but they also lose this sensitivity over time because they adapt to that stimulus, to a point where you're forced to continue increasing the training demand. And the theory is if you deload, by reducing the training demand, you now desensitize the muscles to that stimulus, so you can go back to it and expect greater gains once more. However, we also don't yet know for sure from research, and it's being studied at this moment in time, whether sensitization and resensitization is a phenomenon that actually occurs. Now, the second theory is that a deload may reduce psychological and/or physiological fatigue from the previous weeks where you've been doing a lot of high volume training. As I've been saying, there isn't a lot of research on deloads, but I do want to cite one of the most relevant studies published on the topic, which was released this year by Coleman and colleagues. So it's dated 2024. What they did in this study is they had 39 participants and they split them into a deload group and a non-deload group. Both sets of participants, both groups, were training 4 days a week with the same upper-lower type program. But the deload group took 1 week completely off of training after 4 weeks, and then they trained for another 4, whereas the non-deload group trained throughout all of the 9 weeks. And what they found was that hypertrophy was similar between the two groups, which means that at least in this study, not necessarily all of them, but in this one, with these participants following this specific protocol, a deload did not enhance hypertrophy, but it also didn't decrease it. So, worst case scenario, it simply didn't do anything compared to not deloading. What's also interesting about this study is that the individuals in the deload group reported a decrease in their motivation to train from week 4 to 9, whereas the individuals in the group that didn't deload did not have this decrease in motivation. Now, the authors did point out that the differences in the motivation values can be considered relatively modest, and they specifically state in the paper their practical meaningfulness thus remains questionable. I'm quoting word for word right now. However, it is interesting, and it suggests that since the people who deloaded were forced to deload, it was pre-planned, they might have felt like they didn't need it, and they didn't actually enjoy doing it. They would have perhaps preferred continuing to train instead and not lose the momentum that they had gained. Now, you may think, well, it didn't improve hypertrophy, and it seems like it led to potentially a decrease in motivation, so it's useless. Well, we can't know that because it's just one study. We might have seen different results if the participants had deloaded when they needed to, not in a pre-planned fashion. And we might have seen different outcomes as well if instead of taking a complete week off, they'd continued to train, but they'd simply done easier sessions. At the moment, the way I implement deloads into a client's program is the following. It's always done in a reactionary manner, meaning I deload a client if there's a reason for it. I don't necessarily plan it in advance. The only exception to that would be if a client comes to me and they open up about the fact that they really struggle with their relationship with exercise and they struggle with taking rest days. I've had clients tell me, I don't deload, I stop training if I get injured or if I'm sick, and they feel that that doesn't serve them because they can never properly enjoy rest and letting their body rest and recover. So in that particular case, I help them overcome this poor relationship with training by scheduling deloads to help them train their mind to accept that deloading is fine and nothing bad is going to happen if they take a week of training. Their muscles are not going to fall off. They're not going to overeat their way to obesity or whatever it may be that they're afraid is going to happen. By taking a pre-planned deload, we're able to dispel these irrational fears. Other than that, I don't necessarily pre-plan a deload, and sometimes I don't have to plan a deload at all, reactionary or not, because, for example, a client may go on holiday and tell me that for that particular holiday, they don't intend to train. So that becomes their deload. As for the protocol I implement, it will depend on the person, and because there are no right or wrong answers at this moment in time, I go off personal preference. I have some clients who prefer not to train at all, some clients who like to do a couple of sessions, just easy ones with less volume and a lower intensity of effort. And I also alternate, whereby sometimes a client will want to take a complete week off, and sometimes they'll want to do a couple of sessions. And that is how I implement deload and what I think and what my understanding is of the research on deloads at this moment in time. I don't think we know for sure that they are helpful to enhance hypertrophy, but I do believe that they can have a psychological effect. Because usually, when I implement a deload, what happens is that by the end of the deload, the client is chomping at the bit to go back to training, whereas at the start of the deload, they were kind of dragging themselves through the sessions. So, if nothing else, it seems to have some psychological benefits under the right circumstances. So, it's not a tool that I would completely discard, but I'm also not ready to say that it definitely benefits hypertrophy. Question number 3 is, should I do isolation lifts for the glutes, or are hip thrusts enough? Both isolation lifts and compound lifts like hip thrusts can be an excellent component within a resistance training program to grow the glutes. However, it's not so important what kind of exercises you do. What matters more to begin with is your total volume, because we know that there's a dose response relationship between volume and hypertrophy, whereby it seems like the more volume you can do progress with and recover from, the more hypertrophy you may be able to trigger, provided that the volume that you do involves sets taken close enough to failure. So when I'm referring to volume, just to be clear, I'm talking about set volume. So the number of sets for the target muscle that you're doing within a certain period of time. And normally, set volume is considered on a weekly basis. So I'll be talking about weekly set volume. Saying that, while yes, in a vacuum, more volume that you can recover from and progress with, taken close enough to failure, may be better for hypertrophy, nobody lives in a vacuum. So ultimately, the amount of volume you can do depends on how many sessions you're doing and your time availability within each individual session. And that's when exercise selection becomes relevant. Because if you're somebody who only has time to train 3 days per week for an hour, then compound lifts are going to give you the best bang for your buck, because in the time that it takes you to complete, let's say, 3 sets of a compound lift, you're going to be able to train 2, 3 different muscles. Whereas if you spent that same time on an isolation lift, then you would only be training one joint and therefore only one muscle. I do believe that combining isolation lifts and compound lifts is going to give you the best hypertrophic results, because there's some research that shows that it may be better to have some exercise variation within a training program over time, not necessarily session to session, but for example, for some months you would perform certain exercises and other months you would perform other exercises. And over time you achieve this certain degree of variation, which seems to be better than simply performing the same lifts over and over again. And there is also research showing that regional hypertrophy is possible, meaning we can hypertrophy specific regions of the muscle with certain exercises and other regions with other exercises. So by taking an approach where over time you're rotating through a number of compound lifts and isolation lifts, you're likely going to maximize muscle growth in that particular area. So in summary, the first overarching variable to think about is the total volume for the target muscle. And your exercise selection is then going to serve the amount of volume that you're practically able to do. Whereby if you can train for a reduced number of days, then your volume will be constrained, and that's when you want the majority of your lifts to be compound lifts. Whereas if you have more time, you're training 4 or 5 days a week or more, so you're able to do more volume, then you can include a much wider variety of both isolation and compound lifts. To clarify, I'm not saying that there's never a place for isolation lifts if you're training 3 days per week. I'm saying that you want to dose them appropriately, whereby you're prioritizing compound lifts. And if you have any time left and you really want to develop a specific muscle, like the glutes, then you may throw in a few sets of an isolation lift. And now let's tackle the final question about training and the final question for this episode, which is, if more volume equals more hypertrophy, instead of letting my reps drop from set to set using the same load, should I lower the load so that I can keep my reps higher? And this is an excellent question because it allows me to explain the difference between set volume and volume load. I've already explained what set volume is. Volume load is sets times reps times load, and it's measured in tonnage. And it doesn't seem to have the same dose-response relationship with hypertrophy that set volume has. So when you're talking about reps and sets and load, what you're referring to is the volume load. And what we know is that as long as you're performing at least 5 repetitions and max around 30, close enough to failure, it doesn't really seem to matter what exact weight you are using or exactly how many reps you are doing, you are going to stimulate hypertrophy. Now, this is not to say that sticking within a specific rep range is useless. I actually recorded an entire episode on rep ranges and their different benefits with a PhD student, and I am trying to find that for you right now. There it is. That was episode 75, the best rep range for hypertrophy with Daniel Plotkin. So I really encourage you to go back to that episode and listen to it, because yes, there is some more nuance to this conversation than just saying, hey, as long as you're doing 5 to 30 reps close enough to failure, you're good. However, for the purpose of this question, what I'm saying is that you don't need to lower the load set to set to keep your reps higher. Whether I would choose to let your reps drop set to set with the same load, or to lower the load to keep your reps higher, would depend on the specific rep range that's being programmed. So for example, if you are training within the 8 to 12 rep range, and on set number 1 you only perform 7 reps, then that's when I would drop the load a little, so that in the next set you would be able to stick within the 8 to 12 rep range, because the goal is to get the benefits that you would gain from that specific rep range, which is not only hypertrophy, but it will definitely include hypertrophy. But purely from a hypertrophic perspective, again, as long as you're meeting that minimum 5 rep requirement and that maximum of 30, and you're training close enough to failure, you will be building muscle either way. And with that, my dear listeners, we've come to the end of part 1 of this Q&A. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, if you want to connect with me or to apply for coaching, all the links will be in the show notes. And with that said, I will talk to you next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.